The alien werewolf princess tried to bite me. Now she says I'm her mate. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The chilled air of moonlit throne hall hung heavy with the scent of pine and stone, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled vessels Nick had grown accustomed to. Firelight from massive, wrought-iron braziers flickered against banners woven with the sigils of the wolf clans, their deep red and black threads swaying with every soft gust of wind that slipped through the unsealed gaps of the cavernous chamber. For a human diplomat, the raw, elemental nature of the court was an overwhelming sensory experience. Nick, standing with his small delegation, felt the scrutiny of 100 golden eyes fixed upon him, a piercing gaze that spoke of a species honed by generations of life on this frigid, unforgiving planet. His rugged human features, marked by a faded scar along his jawline from a past skirmish, were a beacon of foreignness in a sea of silver fur and imposing height. He stood his ground, his green eyes, full of defiance and a professional wariness, refusing to falter under their gaze, his black officer's coat a sharp, disciplined line against the wild, flowing furs of the nobles. He was here to secure a critical trade treaty, a mission that had taken him light years from home, but the sheer gravity of the moment, the palpable anticipation in the air, made him feel as though he were walking on a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless chasm. At the center of the hall, bathed in a celestial glow that filtered through a high, open window, stood the object of all this ceremony, Princess Amour. She was a being of striking contradictions. Her frame, a towering 7.5 feet, was draped in a simple, elegant gown of midnight blue that did little to conceal the voluptuous curves of her powerful form. Long, braided black hair swayed behind her, almost indistinguishable from the wagging of her tail, a continuous, subtle movement that belied the stillness of her pose. Yet it was her eyes, a piercing, intelligent gold, and the fine, almost imperceptible sheen of silver fur along her arms and legs, that marked her as something fundamentally different from any creature he had ever encountered. The ritual was ancient, a coming-of-age ceremony meant to prove the heir's control over their primal instincts. Her father, the old king, a stern, grizzled veteran of 100 winters, watched from his stone throne with a mixture of pride and paternal anxiety. Amour moved through the ceremonial motions with a grace that was both regal and predatory, her movements fluid and purposeful. Nick watched her, his mind cataloging the details for his official report, trying to understand a culture so different from his own, where instinct and intellect seemed to exist in such a strange and potent harmony. The ritual was progressing without incident, a testament to the princess's iron will, when the first discordant note shattered the hall's tranquil atmosphere. A figure from the shadows of a side gallery stepped forward, a minor lord whose name was whispered with contempt even among his peers. He was a weasel his stature slighter, his eyes narrower than the rest. He spoke a single, venomous word, a challenge that struck at the very heart of the sense of honor. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Amour's serene expression, a mask of practiced calm, fractured. A deep guttural snarl ripped from her throat, a sound that was not human or alien but something more basic, more terrifyingly primal. The wagging of her tail ceased, the long black braid became a whip of static energy, and her golden eyes, once clear and intelligent, swirled with a raw, undiluted fury that promised violence. The nobles in the hall recoiled, a collective intake of breath creating a vacuum of silence as the princess, losing herself to the rage, began to shift. The silver fur along her limbs thickened, her hands curled into claws, and her regal posture bent into a crouch, every muscle tensing for a lethal leap. She was no longer a princess but a beast, a pure embodiment of the ferocity that simmered just beneath the surface of her people's civilization. Her enraged, unthinking gaze swept the room, searching for the source of her fury, for a target to sate her instinct. It settled on the closest living thing, the most foreign presence, the human diplomat who stood in the middle of a species he did not fully understand. Nick saw the shift in her focus, The raw, animalistic intent in her golden eyes and his military training, the very foundation of his being, took over. He did not freeze in terror or attempt to run. Instead, with a speed that startled even the swift, he reacted. As Amor launched herself across the polished stone floor, a blur of muscle and fury, Nick's hand shot up to the clasp of his officer's coat. He tore it open, pulling the thick, heavy material from his shoulders and thrusting it forward, using it as a makeshift shield to absorb the impact of her charge. He held his arm out, a solid, unyielding brace, and caught her midair. Amor's teeth, meant to sink deep and tear, closed not on flesh, but on the coarse fabric of his coat, her momentum slamming her against him. The force of the impact was immense, knocking the air from his lungs, but he held firm, his boots scraping on the stone floor as he braced against her considerable weight. It was in that moment, a chaotic tangle of fabric and muscle, that the fangs meant for his jugular grazed the skin of his forearm. It was not a bite that broke the skin, not even a scratch that drew blood, but a contact so profound and searing it felt as though he had been struck by lightning. The sensation was a burning fire that raced up his arm and through his entire body, an electric shock that made every one of his muscles seize. The moment her teeth, not just the fangs but the entire jawline, made contact, the rage that had consumed her dissipated as if it had never been. The primal fury vanished from her eyes, replaced by a look of bewildered, golden shock. The snarling ceased, her muscles relaxed, and she fell away from him, landing on her feet with a soft thump, her tail beginning to wag again in a slow, confused rhythm. She stood for a long moment, staring at the faint, glowing mark her teeth had left on his arm, and then, with a shake of her head as if to clear a fog, she looked from his eyes to the court, the full gravity of the ancient lore dawning on her. The silence that had fallen upon the throne hall was absolute, a profound void filled only by the crackling of the fire and the low, stunned murmurs of the nobles. Amor, her gaze now clear and resolute, turned her full attention back to the human diplomat. She took a step closer to him, her towering height an imposing shadow. Then, her tail wagging with a slow, steady certainty, she spoke, her voice clear and resonant, echoing through the vast chamber. The declaration was a thunderclap that shattered the silence and the expectations of everyone present, an immutable law spoken into being. "He is my mate," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt, "my fated partner." The words fell like a divine judgment, a pronouncement that sealed a destiny neither of them had ever asked for or wanted. Nick, his lungs still burning from the impact, stared at her, his mind unable to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. He had come to negotiate, to use words and logic to build a bridge between two worlds. Instead, a moment of instinct had landed him in a bizarre, unbreakable, and very public engagement to an alien princess. The court erupted. The low murmurs of shock became a cacophony of whispers, of indignant gasps and bewildered chatter. Guards shifted uneasily, their hands on their weapons, unsure how to react to this unprecedented event. Nick's own entourage, a handful of human officers and analysts, looked on in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of professional horror and personal disbelief. The king, Amor's father, finally stood from his throne, his face a study in conflicting emotions. He was torn between his duty to the ancient lore and the stark reality of the situation. His heir, the future of his people, was now bonded to a human, an outsider whose presence was a political anomaly. He could not defy the fated declaration, for it was the will of the spirits that guided their people, and any attempt to circumvent it would be a betrayal of his ancestors and his kind. He held up a massive hand, a silent command for the noise to cease, and the court reluctantly fell back into a stunned quiet. Nick, still reeling from the events, could only look on, his mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation in a world governed by magic and fate. He was a man of science and diplomacy, and this was an issue with no precedent in any galactic codex. In the ensuing silence, Nick's mind was a maelstrom of thoughts. His mission, a delicate and high-stakes endeavor, had just been turned upside down. He had come to with a clear goal, to establish a stable relationship between two disparate civilizations. Now he was not just an envoy, but a pawn, an essential and inescapable part of their strange, archaic rituals. The fated bond, while perhaps a convenient narrative for the court, was a political and personal disaster for him. He had a life, a career, and a past that had no room for alien royalty. Yet even as he thought this, a strange, undeniable warmth began to spread from the spot on his arm where her teeth had grazed him. It was a sensation of quiet belonging, of an inexplicable connection that felt both foreign and familiar, and it was the last thing he wanted. He had to be a man of logic, a man of reason, and a man who could get himself out of this mess. He looked at Amor, at her golden eyes now filled with a strange, nascent curiosity, and knew that he was about to begin the most complicated negotiation of his life, one that involved not just a treaty, but his own future, and the very unpredictable whims of a universe that had just thrown him its strangest and most beautiful surprise. The king's decree, delivered with the heavy finality of a collapsing mountain, cut through the clamor of the throne hall and cemented Nick's bewildering new reality. With a voice that resonated with the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 winters, the monarch declared that the will of the ancestors was clear and undeniable, and that the bond forged in that moment of a primordial calm was sacred, a twist of destiny that could neither be questioned nor undone, regardless of the species or station of those involved. He dismissed the court, leaving Nick standing in a now-hushed chamber, alone with Amor, her father, and the lingering scent of burning pine. Nick's mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and strategy, was failing to compute this new paradigm. His professional career, his entire existence built on the bedrock of reason and calculated risk, had just been turned on its head by an ancient prophecy and a moment of animalistic chaos. He watched as the king, with a solemn nod to his daughter and a single, appraising glance at the human, strode out of the hall, the sound of his departure echoing like the closing of a tomb. Nick was trapped, his diplomatic mission having morphed into a personal prison, and the key was standing right in front of him, her wagging tail a silent, baffling betrayal of the fierce warrior he had seen moments before. Amor, for her part, had returned to a state of calm that was almost as unsettling as her previous rage, her golden eyes now holding a simmering contempt for the small, soft human who had somehow, inexplicably, become central to her life. She saw him not as a savior, but as a political complication, a blemish on the perfectly laid plans for her ascension. In the quiet solitude of the throne hall, with the moonlight casting long shadows over the stone pillars, her contempt for him was a palpable force. She spoke for the first time since the declaration, her voice low and even, devoid of the earlier primal snarl. "Do not mistake this for affection, human. This fated bond is nothing more than a political tool, a tradition my father will use to secure my position. To us, you are a curious, weak creature who stumbled into a moment of destiny you do not deserve and cannot comprehend." Her words were a direct assault, a verbal challenge that was as sharp and cutting as any blade, and they wiped the last vestige of confusion from Nick's mind, replacing it with his characteristic defiance. Nick, his green eyes meeting her golden ones without flinching, a ghost of a smile playing on his jawline, stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he could see the intricate patterns of her silver fur. "I'm not here for affection, princess," he countered, his voice a low, steady rumble, "and I'm certainly not here by choice. I'm a diplomat, a professional who knows how to make the best of a bad situation. Consider this a temporary, mutually beneficial arrangement. You get to keep your throne, and I get to go home with a signed treaty, eventually. It's nothing more than a contract between two deeply unwilling parties, and I suggest we stick to the terms." His directness seemed to take her by surprise, the momentary flicker in her eyes a testament to the fact that she had expected him to be intimidated, to grovel, to accept his new role with meek submission. He had seen enough of the universe to know when to stand his ground, and bowing to an alien princess was not on his agenda. Their first official meeting as a couple, was a comical disaster. A formal dinner held in a grand dining hall with a massive hearth where flames danced in a manner that seemed to mimic the very temper of the people. The nobles, a mixture of awe, suspicion, and morbid curiosity in their eyes, watched them with an intensity that made every bite of food a performance. Amor, with an air of practiced regality, expertly handled her massive portions of smoked meat and steamed roots, her movements fluid and efficient. Nick, accustomed to the delicate intricacies of human diplomatic dinners, found himself at a complete loss. He had no idea how to properly use the crude, oversized utensils, nor could he figure out a polite way to refuse the raw, glistening grubs that were presented as a delicacy. Amor, with a mischievous glint in her golden eyes, watched his struggle with ill-disguised amusement, occasionally offering a sharp, sarcastic comment under her breath about his delicate human constitution and lack of primal finesse. Their entire interaction was a thinly veiled clash of cultures and wills, a tense, simmering pot of resentment and misunderstanding that was only kept from boiling over by the sheer weight of their public charade. Over the next several days, their unwilling courtship became a series of absurd and humiliating rituals. Nick was subjected to formal bonding ceremonies, where he was expected to participate in feats of strength against suitors twice his size, his human agility and combat training the only thing that kept him from being completely outmatched. He was a professional, a man who had faced down hostile political factions and rogue governments, but none of his experience had prepared him for the sheer, brutal honesty of social conventions. Amor, meanwhile, was forced to put on a show of affection that she clearly abhorred, her touch as light as a whisper and as cold as the wind as she would place a hand on his back or guide him through a dance. In private, the facade would fall away, and they would return to their strange, barbed truce. Nick would spend hours in his chamber, poring over ancient texts and historical records, trying to find a loophole. A hidden escape clause in the archaic laws of that would allow him to terminate the bond and return home with a finished treaty. His search was frustrating and fruitless, the laws of fate and destiny seemingly without exception. He could feel Amor's impatience growing with each passing day, her golden eyes following him with a thinly veiled irritation. She was a woman of action, an alien princess born to lead, and the enforced stagnation of their engagement was clearly grating on her nerves. One evening, after a particularly exhausting series of ceremonies, they found themselves alone in a small, private library, a quiet sanctuary from the prying eyes of the court. The room was filled with the scent of old parchment and the low hum of an archaic heating unit. Nick, defeated for the moment, slumped into a chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "This is insane," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "In my world, a contract like this would have a dozen escape clauses and a clear termination date. There's no way two beings, especially from different species, can be bound like this indefinitely." Amor, who was idly running her long fingers over the spine of an old text, turned her head to look at him, her golden eyes narrowed in thought. "You humans and your need for control," she said, her voice laced with a cold condescension. "You think you can bind the universe with your little contracts and your laws, but destiny, fate, whatever you wish to call it, does not bend to your will. We do not choose our mates. We are chosen by them, a connection so deep it cannot be broken by your logical machinations." Nick looked up at her, a spark of genuine curiosity replacing his frustration. "What about the other candidates, the ones who were here before I stumbled in?" he asked, a hint of something more than just professional interest in his voice. "If this bond is so unbreakable, what about the men you've seen? Did you have a choice then?" Amor let out a short, hollow laugh that held no humor. "A choice? No, they were tested, put through a series of trials to see if they were worthy, and none of them were. You human, you simply walked in and the ancestors chose you. It is as simple and as infuriating as that." There was a bitterness in her voice, a raw resentment that surprised him. He had always seen her as the powerful, untouchable princess, but in that moment she seemed more like a prisoner, bound by a tradition that she found as stifling as he did. The shared frustration was a fragile bridge between them, a small point of common ground in a relationship built on cultural divides and personal animosity. The quiet understanding, the knowledge that they were both pawns in a cosmic game neither of them had agreed to play, settled between them, a silent pact that was more real than any of the public declarations. Their animosity was still there, but beneath it, a nascent, uncomfortable, and deeply pragmatic partnership was beginning to form. They were united in their mutual, simmering resentment of their shared fate, and for now, that would have to be enough to keep their fragile alliance from crumbling under the weight of an entire planet's expectations. As days bled into nights on the frozen world of, the uneasy alliance between Nick and Princess Amour into a fragile, functional truce. Their public interactions, once stiff and full of barely concealed contempt, began to take on a more natural rhythm, a performance born of necessity but polished by a shared resentment. The court, a place of constant scrutiny and silent judgment, was slowly starting to accept the bizarre pairing. They saw the human who stood his ground and the princess who had, for the first time in her life, found a mate. In private, however, the charade melted away, and their small, shared sanctuary in the library became a place of barbed words and tactical discussions. Nick, relentless in his pursuit of a logical solution, spent hours poring over the ancient texts of the, looking for a forgotten loophole in the laws of mate bonding, while Amour, her long tail swaying in a slow, restless rhythm, watched him with a mixture of impatience and reluctant curiosity. She had begun to recognize that his human intelligence, while lacking in her people's primal ferocity, possessed a different kind of strength, a meticulous, problem-solving mind that saw connections where others saw only fate. It was during one such evening, with the wind howling like a mournful wolf outside the library windows, that Nick found something. He had been reading a faded, brittle scroll, a historical account of a legendary king who had fallen ill with a mysterious affliction during his ascension ceremony. The king had suffered from bouts of uncontrollable rage, a sickness that had nearly cost him his throne until a rare, luminescent lichen, found only in the deepest parts of the forests, was used to calm him. The text mentioned a single telling detail. The lichen's dust had been applied to a ceremonial mask, and the king's rage had been triggered only when he wore it. Nick's green eyes, sharp with discovery, scanned the text again, a hypothesis beginning to form in his mind. He looked at Amour, who was curled up in a large stone chair by the fire, her golden eyes half-lidded in a state of placid repose. "Amour," he said, his voice low and urgent, "that rage of yours, the one you had in the throne hall, do you remember it at all?" Her eyes snapped open, a flicker of irritation crossing her face at the intrusion. "Remember it," she scoffed. "It was a loss of control, a flaw I have worked my entire life to suppress. It is not something I care to dwell on." "But did it feel natural?" he pressed, ignoring her tone. "Did it feel like your own rage or something else?" She hesitated for a moment, a crease appearing between her brows. "It was powerful," she admitted, her voice dropping. "More so than any rage I have ever felt. It came on too quickly. One moment I was calm, the next a fire was raging in my veins." A spark of understanding, a sudden horrifying insight lit up in her eyes. "You think it was a drug?" whispered, the thought seemingly foreign and repulsive to her. Nick nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I think the rival who challenged you didn't just speak a single word of contempt. I think he exposed you to something, a compound designed to trigger a primal reaction in your species, to make you look weak and unstable in front of the court. My presence, my unexpected intervention, was just a variable he couldn't have accounted for." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of this new revelation. Amour, a warrior and a leader, a being of honor and instinct, had been manipulated, made a fool of in front of her people. Her pride, a source of great strength, was now a source of deep, burning humiliation, and it ignited in her a cold, calculated fury that was far more dangerous than the mindless rage she had displayed before. The conspiracy, once a mere theory, began to unravel with a terrifying swiftness. Nick, with Amour's reluctant but growing cooperation, used his diplomatic credentials to access more recent court records, focusing on the weeks leading up to the Ascension ceremony. He cross-referenced the names of all the minor nobles present at the event, looking for anything out of place. It was Amor who made the crucial connection. She remembered a series of subtle, seemingly insignificant changes in the weeks leading up to the ceremony: a new assistant to the High Chamberlain, a different clan leader in charge of the ceremonial braziers, and a sudden, quiet illness that had sidelined her personal guards. With Nick's methodical mind and her intuitive grasp of the court's subtle power dynamics, they began to weave the threads together. The rival who had challenged her, a lord, was a political opportunist, but he lacked the power and influence to orchestrate such a complex plot on his own. He was a pawn, a distraction meant to provoke her while the real players pulled the strings from the shadows. The true mastermind, they concluded, had to be someone with unparalleled access to the palace, someone trusted and revered. The suspicion began to fall, with a sickening sense of dread, on her own court. The more they dug, the more the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. They discovered that the ceremonial braziers, which had burned a specially scented oil during the ritual, had been tampered with. The oil had been mixed with a potent, bioengineered compound, an aerosolized irritant designed to trigger the very part of the brain that governed their instinctual rage. The compound, a substance that should have been harmless to humans, had reacted with Nick's officer's coat, a specialized fabric woven with a unique metallic thread, to create a minor electrical charge upon contact, a small, harmless spark that had somehow, inexplicably, been the perfect counter to the chemical rage that was consuming Amor. The fated bond wasn't magic. It was a scientific anomaly, a twist of fate that had turned a failed assassination attempt into a preordained union. Their partnership, initially born of resentment and obligation, was now a fragile, necessary alliance forged in the fire of a shared conspiracy. They were no longer just a pair of unwilling pawns. They were two people, a human and an alien, who were now the only ones standing in the way of a full-blown coup. With their enemies now aware that they were onto the conspiracy, the palace suddenly became a place of mortal danger. Amor's guards, once loyal and protective, now seemed to watch her with a new, unsettling intensity. Whispers followed them in the halls, and a growing number of officials who had been outwardly supportive now seemed to shrink from their presence. They were a threat, an unpredictable variable in a carefully laid plot, and it was only a matter of time before their enemies moved to silence them permanently. Nick, with his military training, could feel the rising tension, the tightening noose of betrayal. His pragmatic, logical mind screamed that they needed to act, to expose the conspiracy before it was too late. But Amor, with her instinctual understanding of her people, knew that the truth would only be believed if they could find undeniable proof, something that would sway a court that was already teetering on the edge of rebellion. They could no longer trust anyone, not her closest advisors, not her father's guards, not even the food they ate or the air they breathed. The throne hall, once a symbol of her power and her destiny, was now a gilded cage, and the only way to survive was to escape it and fight from the outside. Their plan was audacious and terrifyingly simple. Under the cover of a routine diplomatic stroll through the royal gardens, they would slip away, using a series of old service tunnels that Amor knew from her childhood. It was a risky gamble, a flight into the wild, frozen landscape of where even her people struggled to survive without the comforts of the palace. But it was their only chance. As they prepared for their escape, the tension between them became something new, something almost tender. They were no longer just two strangers trapped by circumstance, but a team, a partnership forged in adversity. Nick, with his careful, methodical preparations, packed rations and survival gear, a small arsenal of human ingenuity against the raw, untamed world outside. Amor, in turn, silently watched him, her golden eyes filled with a new, grudging respect for his competence and his quiet resilience. He wasn't a warrior, but he was a survivor, and she found herself trusting his instincts almost as much as her own. The night they were to leave, as the moon cast its pale, ethereal light over the snowy peaks of, Amor turned to him in the dimly lit hall, and for the first time her voice held no trace of contempt. "You should have stayed on your ship, human," she said, her voice soft. "It would have been safer." Nick looked at her, a small, knowing smile on his face, his green eyes filled with a new kind of defiance, one born not of anger but of loyalty. "And miss all this?" he asked, his tone laced with a dry humor that made her almost smile in return. "Not a chance, princess." With their fate hanging in the balance, they slipped into the night, their lives now bound not by a ritual but by a shared purpose and a secret that could topple a throne. The cold, biting air of wilderness slapped Nick in the face, a brutal and immediate farewell to the sheltered warmth of the palace. His human lungs, accustomed to the filtered air of starships and sterile diplomatic chambers, protested the raw, unprocessed chill, but he pushed the discomfort down, his mind already a complex map of tactical decisions and survival strategies. They had slipped out of the palace under the cover of a freezing windstorm, their exit masked by the swirling snow and the sheer chaos of the element. Amor, a creature of this world, moved through the treacherous landscape with an almost supernatural grace, her powerful form a dark, silent shadow against the white. She was a natural hunter, her movements fluid and instinctual, her ears twitching to the faintest sounds of the forest, her tail a low, constant metronome of alertness. Nick, in his heavy human boots and coat, felt clumsy and loud in comparison. He relied on his carefully packed gear, a portable compass, a low-power thermal scanner, and the basic survival kit he had somehow managed to sneak into his bag to keep them from getting lost in the vast, unmarked expanse of snow and ice. The chase had begun. They were not long into their journey when the first patrol found them. The sound of their pursuit was muffled by the wind, but Amor, her golden eyes narrowed to slits, had heard them long before Nick's thermal scanner had picked up their heat signatures. "4 of them," she growled, her voice a low rumble. "Coming from the north." Nick, looking at the blinking dots on his scanner, confirmed her assessment, a newfound respect for her primal senses growing in his heart. They didn't have time to run. The forest, a labyrinth of massive, ice-coated trees, offered both cover and a trap. With no other option, they chose to make a stand. They hid behind a massive, moss-covered boulder, the kind that had sat untouched since the dawn of the planet, the howling wind a perfect cover for their breathing. When the 4 guards came into view, their heavy footsteps muffled by the snow, Nick and Amor moved as one, a seamless, coordinated attack that was a testament to their new, symbiotic partnership. Amor, with her immense strength and terrifying speed, took the first 2 guards head-on, her movements a blur of silver fur and deadly grace. She was a whirlwind of motion, her claws extended, her snarl a terrifying war cry that echoed through the silent forest. Nick, in the meantime, used his human ingenuity, using a small, high-frequency sonic device to disorient the other 2 guards, throwing them off balance long enough for him to incapacitate them with his officer's combat training. They worked with a terrifying efficiency, a perfect combination of raw power and calculated strategy, and within minutes, the 4 guards were lying unconscious in the snow, their weapons safely disarmed. The close call made their flight into something more tangible, more real. They were no longer just running from a conspiracy, they were fighting for their lives. The constant threat, the knowledge that at any moment another patrol could find them, forced them to rely on each other completely. The animosity that had defined their early interactions began to melt away, replaced by a deep, unspoken trust. Nick, a man who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, found himself relying on Amor's instincts, on her ability to sense danger, and find a path through the wilderness that his human eyes could never have seen. She led him through hidden, ancient paths known only to her people, routes that snaked through treacherous ice canyons and across frozen rivers. As they traveled, the shared hardship became a crucible for their relationship, forging a bond that was far stronger and more meaningful than the one dictated by prophecy. They shared their food, their warmth, their thoughts. Nick talked about his life on Earth, about the quiet, green mountains he grew up in, and about the thrill of exploring the cosmos as a diplomat. Amor, in turn, spoke of the immense pressure of being the heir to the throne, of her solitary, regimented life, and of her deep, abiding love for the raw, untamed nature of her planet. The cold, unforgiving landscape with its endless forests and shimmering auroras, became the backdrop for their transformation. They no longer saw each other as a political inconvenience or a curious creature. Nick, as he watched Amor, saw not a volatile princess but a woman of immense strength and quiet courage, a leader who carried the weight of her people on her shoulders with a regal grace that was truly beautiful. He saw her protectiveness of him, the way she would instinctively place herself between him and the cold wind, or the way she would wait for him to catch his breath on a particularly steep incline, her golden eyes filled with a patient, watchful understanding. Amor, in turn, began to see beyond the human's small stature and seemingly fragile form. She saw a man of immense resilience and deep-seated loyalty. He did not possess her physical prowess, but his mind was a force of nature, his ability to analyze, strategize, and adapt a strength that was as potent and deadly as any of her own. He was not a warrior born of her world, but a survivor from a world she did not understand, and she found herself drawn to his unwavering refusal to give up, to his quiet confidence in the face of impossible odds. Their journey led them to a hidden sanctuary, a place of ancient power that was sacred to the royal family. It was an old, crumbling temple carved into the side of a glacier, a place where generations of rulers had come to find strength and clarity. The journey was long and grueling, a test of their endurance and their resolve. By the time they reached the sanctuary, they were bruised, exhausted, and hungry, but their spirits were surprisingly high. They had a destination, a goal, and a shared purpose that had united them in a way that the fated bond never could have. Inside the sanctuary, with the silence of the glacier surrounding them, they found a moment of true peace. The air was still and warm, and the only sound was the soft, rhythmic dripping of melting ice. Amor, no longer the volatile princess, but a tired, weary woman, leaned against the cold stone, her tail a slow, content rhythm on the floor. Nick, equally exhausted, sat beside her, his hand resting on the ground near hers. There was no need for words, no need for pretense. In that moment, they were simply two people, two souls who had been thrown together by a cosmic joke and had, against all odds, found a way to not just survive, but to thrive. The shared stillness of the sanctuary was a moment of grace, a quiet interlude in the midst of their frantic flight. Nick finally took the opportunity to tend to his injuries, small cuts and scrapes from their journey, and Amor, without a word, came to his side, her large, gentle fingers inspecting a gash on his arm with a concern that was both new and deeply touching. It was in that small, intimate moment of care that their relationship truly shifted. She saw his human frailty, but she also saw his strength. He saw her tenderness, a side of her that she had kept hidden from the world. There was no more pretense, no more biting remarks or sarcastic comments. They were a team, a genuine partnership born of shared hardship, and in the quiet of the glacier sanctuary, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors, Nick looked at her, at the quiet, focused intensity in her golden eyes, and knew that his feelings for her were no longer about duty or survival. They were about something real, something more powerful than any treaty or any prophecy, and for the first time since he had set foot on, he knew that he did not want to go home without her. The cold world of, once a symbol of his professional duty, had become a home for his heart, and the wolf princess he had been forced to protect had become the person he never wanted to leave. The tranquil silence of the ancient temple, a brief and precious respite, was shattered by the distinct, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on the hard-packed snow outside. Nick's head shot up, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the small, concealed blade he carried, a habit from his days of off-world security detail. Amor, who had been resting with her eyes closed, was instantly alert, her ears swiveling in the direction of the sound, her golden eyes now wide and focused. their newfound tranquility replaced by a steely, predatory alertness. The footsteps were too uniform, too deliberate to belong to a creature of the wild. They were a hunting party and they were closing in. They had been found. There was no time for questions or recriminations. The shared, unspoken understanding between them was so strong now that a single look was all that was needed. They both knew their time in the sanctuary was at an end, and their enemies were not far behind. They were cornered, a fact that had always been the most dangerous of all circumstances for a creature of Nick's kind. But he was no longer alone, and he had an ally whose power he was only just beginning to truly appreciate. Amor, with a low growl that was a terrifying blend of frustration and simmering rage, rose to her full height, her form an imposing shadow in the dim light of the temple. "They have followed us," she said, her voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They will not stop until they have us." Nick, his hand still on the blade, simply nodded, his mind already a whirlwind of tactical scenarios. "Then we fight," he said, his voice calm and even, a counterpoint to her raw intensity. "We don't run, we make a stand." His defiance, once a source of irritation for her, was now a source of deep, abiding respect. She had seen it in action, had felt the unyielding resolve that lay beneath his quiet exterior, and she knew that his calm, human courage was as formidable a weapon as her own brute strength. The hunters, a grim-faced party of guards and a single, cloaked figure, entered the temple with an air of cold confidence, their weapons drawn, their golden eyes narrowed in the hunt. They had been tracking them for a full solar cycle, following the faint heat signatures of their bodies and the disturbed snow of their footprints. But they were not prepared for what they found. Not a pair of exhausted, cowering runaways, but two defiant figures standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to fight. As the guards fanned out, their leader, a grizzled old veteran with a scar that ran from his eye to his jaw, gave a low, rumbling order. They began to advance, their movements a synchronized, practiced attack. But before they could engage, the cloaked figure at the back of the group stepped forward, throwing back its hood with a flourish that was as theatrical as it was menacing. The reveal was a gut punch, a betrayal that was as painful as any physical wound. The mastermind of the plot was not a high-ranking noble or a rival clan leader, but Amor's own mentor, the High Counselor of the court, a wise and venerable elder who had guided her since she was a pup. The High Counselor, his face a mask of cold, intellectual disdain, stepped into the light, his voice a chillingly smooth baritone. "My dear Amor," he said, his words dripping with a condescending pity, "I had hoped to avoid this unpleasantness. But your refusal to see reason, your foolish decision to flee, has left me with no choice." He explained his plan, his voice a calm, logical narrative of ambition and power. He had always seen Amor as too wild, too primal to rule, a creature of instinct who would bring their people back into the Dark Ages. He believed that the people needed a new kind of leader, a leader who was not bound by ancient rituals and fated bonds, but by intellect and pure, unadulterated power. He had used an engineered compound, a substance he had been perfecting for years, to trigger her primal rage. The plan had been to discredit her in front of the court, to show them that she was unfit to rule, and then to seize the throne himself. He had never anticipated Nick's intervention, a random, unforeseen event that had not only saved Amor, but had, in his own twisted logic, created a pure, unassailable bond that made his original plan moot. The fated bond, he said, was not a matter of prophecy, but a scientific anomaly, and it was a bond he was now going to break permanently. The High Counselor raised a hand and the guards advanced, but before they could reach them, Nick, his green eyes blazing with a cold, focused fury, stepped forward. "You're a fool," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You thought you could control the universe with your little compounds and your carefully laid plans, but you couldn't control her, and you certainly can't control what happens next." His words, a direct challenge to the High Counselor's meticulously constructed reality, seemed to enrage the old more than any physical threat. He snarled, his eyes flashing with a raw, unexpected rage, and he gave a low, guttural command. The guards charged, a wall of muscle and weapons, but they were not prepared for the seamless, coordinated attack that followed. Amor, with a terrifying battle cry, met them head-on, her movements a blur of silver fur and deadly grace. She was a whirlwind of motion, her claws and her teeth a flash of white in the dim light of the temple. Nick, a human in a world of giants, moved with an agility that was as surprising as it was effective. He dodged and weaved between the massive bodies of the guards, his small, concealed blade a flash of silver, his movements precise and purposeful. He was not a warrior but a trained combatant, and he used his human ingenuity, his knowledge of pressure points and weak spots, to incapacitate the guards, one by one. The climax of the battle came when the High Counselor, seeing his guards falling one by one, took a step forward, a look of murderous intent on his face. He pulled a small, glowing vial from his cloak, a concentrated dose of the same compound he had used on Amor. But before he could throw it, Nick, with a speed that was a testament to his human resilience, launched himself at his body a missile of pure, focused force. The High Counselor was taken completely by surprise. He was an intellectual, a strategist, not a warrior, and he was unprepared for the raw, unthinking courage of the human diplomat. The two of them fell, a tangle of limbs and cloaks, the vial of compound shattering on the stone floor with a soft, hissing sound. As the compound's potent vapor filled the air, the guards, their senses overwhelmed by the chemical onslaught, fell to their knees, their bodies racked by a series of uncontrolled tremors. Amor, who had been fighting with a controlled fury, felt the compound's effects, but they were no longer a trigger for her rage. She had been tainted by it once, and now her mind, her instincts, and her will were a wall of pure, focused strength. She simply ignored the feeling, her golden eyes fixed on her former mentor. The High Counselor, his plan in ruins, his body trembling, looked up at her, a look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face. He had tried to play God to control fate, but he had failed. With the High Counselor and his guards now incapacitated, the temple fell silent once more. The battle was over. Nick, bruised but victorious, rose to his feet, his body aching with the strain of the fight. He looked at Amor, at the look of fierce, triumphant pride on her face, and knew that they had not only survived but had won. They had fought together, not as a human and an alien, but as two partners, their individual strengths combining to create an unstoppable force. The conspiracy was exposed, its mastermind in chains, and the path to the throne was now clear. Amor, her golden eyes filled with a new, quiet respect for the man who had fought beside her, took a step towards him. She was no longer just a princess. She was a leader, a queen, and she was no longer alone. Nick, looking at her, saw not just a powerful alien but a woman he had come to love. He had come to negotiate a treaty, to build a bridge between two worlds, but he had found something far more profound. A home, a purpose, and a partner who would stand beside him, no matter what the universe threw their way. The fated bond, a lie they had both initially resented, was now a beautiful, undeniable truth. A bond forged not by prophecy but by blood and fire and courage. The victory in the ancient temple was a cold, hard-won triumph, leaving Nick and Amor standing over the incapacitated form of the High Counselor, their bodies bruised and their hearts racing from the adrenaline of the fight. The air, still thick with the lingering scent of the bioengineered compound, was a silent testament to the betrayal they had just faced. Amor, her golden eyes fixed on her former mentor, felt a deep sense of loss and anger. He had not only tried to usurp her throne, but had also shattered the trust she had placed in him since her youth. Nick, watching her, could see the conflict in her eyes, the warring emotions of a warrior who had just defeated a foe and a leader who had just lost a trusted advisor. He knew that for her, this was not just a battle won, but a painful resolution to a years-long deception. He stepped to her side, his hand resting on her arm in a gesture of quiet support, a silent acknowledgement of her pain and a show of his unwavering loyalty. The simple touch, a human gesture, seemed to ground her, pulling her back from the abyss of her emotions and reminding her that she was no longer alone in this fight. With the conspiracy exposed and its leader captured, the journey back to the throne hall was no longer a frantic flight for survival but a victorious march. Nick and Amor, with the captured High Counselor and the disarmed guards in tow, made their way back through the treacherous landscape of their return a slow but steady progress. The freezing winds that had once been their enemy now seemed to carry the promise of a new dawn, and the snow-covered forests, once a labyrinth of danger, were now a path to justice. Their bond, forged in the crucible of their flight and the fire of their battle, was now a visible and undeniable reality. They walked side by side, their movements synchronized, their unspoken communication a testament to the trust they had built between them. They were no longer the reluctant, fated mates from the throne hall but a team, a partnership that had proven its strength in the face of insurmountable odds. Nick's tactical mind and human ingenuity were a perfect complement to Amor's primal strength and intuitive understanding of her world. They were an unstoppable force, a perfect balance of intellect and instinct, and they were about to use that force to set things right. When they finally arrived back at the palace, the atmosphere was one of palpable tension. The palace guards, still loyal to the king, had been in a state of high alert since their disappearance, and the news of a conspiracy was already a whispered rumor in the halls. Their triumphant return with their enemies in chains was a shock that rippled through the entire court. The king, his face a mask of weary relief, met them in the throne hall, his eyes going from the captured High Counselor to the two of them, standing together, their bond an undeniable force in the room. He listened in a silence that was more profound than any noise as Amor, her voice clear and strong, recounted the conspiracy, the engineered compound, and the betrayal of her mentor. She spoke not just as a princess, but as a leader who had been tested and had passed, her story a powerful testament to her resilience and her wisdom. She did not ask for a judgment. She presented the truth, and the truth was an unassailable weapon. The High Counselor, his once prideful face now a study in silent humiliation, could not deny her words, and his silence was a confession more damning than any testimony. The king, with the gravity of a man who had seen his world turned upside down and right side up in a matter of days, made his judgment. The High Counselor was stripped of his titles and exiled to the farthest, coldest reaches of a punishment that was as fitting as it was severe. The other conspirators, those who had played a part in the plot, were also cast out, their treachery now a stain on their clan's honor for generations to come. The throne was secured, the conspiracy was defeated, and the people, who had been teetering on the edge of a civil war, were now united under the banner of their new queen. But the most important resolution was the one that was made not in front of the court, but in the quiet solitude of the royal gardens. Amor, with the weight of her new title on her shoulders, walked with Nick under the pale light of the moon, the air now filled with a quiet, peaceful stillness. She was no longer the defiant princess he had met in the throne hall. She was a leader who had found her strength, and a woman who had found her purpose. She stopped at a small, frozen pond, its surface a mirror to the glittering stars above, and turned to face him. Her golden eyes filled with a look of deep, abiding respect, and something more met his. "You were right, human," she said, her voice a soft, quiet admission. "The bond was not a matter of prophecy. It was a scientific anomaly, a twist of fate that was a pure coincidence." Nick looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been working towards, the moment he could finally go home, his mission complete, the fated bond, a mere footnote in a successful diplomatic mission. But looking at her, at the woman who had fought beside him and had become his partner, the thought of leaving was more painful than any wound he had ever sustained. He had found a home in her world and in her heart, a home that felt more real and more true than the one he had left behind. "So it's over," he said, his voice low, his words a question more than a statement. "The mission is complete, the treaty is secured, I can go home." The words felt foreign on his tongue, a bitter lie that his heart refused to believe. Amor, with a small, sad smile, took a step closer to him. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can go home. The king has offered you a ship, a token of our gratitude. You can leave whenever you wish." The words, meant to be a kindness, felt like a judgment, a final, painful severing of the bond that had become his world. He looked at her strong, beautiful face, at the long, braided hair that swayed behind her, and knew that he could not leave. His defiance, once a tool of his survival, was now a quiet, resolute declaration of his love. He would not go. He could not go. He had found his destiny, and his destiny was standing right in front of him. "I'm not going," he said, the words a raw, honest confession that hung in the cold air. "I'm not going home. My home is here with you." The words were a gamble, a final, terrifying leap of faith, but they were the truth, a truth that had been forged in the fire of their flight and the chaos of their fight. Amor, her eyes wide with surprise and a fragile, blooming joy, took his hand in hers, her large, gentle fingers wrapping around his. "The bond," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It was not a lie. The ritual was not a truth. But our connection, the one we built, the one we fought for, that is the only truth that matters." She brought his hand to her lips and kissed it, a gesture of profound respect and a silent declaration of her love. In that moment, under the shimmering light of the auroras, a human and an alien, a diplomat and a queen, found their new home in each other, their story not one of fate but of choice, and their bond not one of prophecy but of a fierce, earned love. The resolution was complete, the conspiracy was over, and the treaty was signed. Their world was in order, and their future, once a chaotic, uncertain mess, was now a clear, shining path. Amor, now queen of her people, ruled with a quiet confidence that had been forged in her journey, her rule a testament to her strength and her wisdom. Nick, her consort, became not just a diplomat, but an ambassador between two worlds, a bridge between two cultures that had once seemed to have nothing in common. He worked tirelessly, using his human ingenuity to bring new technologies and new ideas too, while Amor, with her intuitive understanding of her people, used her strength and her wisdom to lead them into a new era of peace and prosperity. Their relationship, a love story born of chaos and conspiracy, became a legend, a testament to the fact that love could be found in the most unexpected of places, and that destiny was not something that was given to you, but something that you fought for together. The final scene of their story was a testament to their love, a simple, quiet moment in the throne hall, with Nick sitting on a large, custom-built chair beside her throne, his hand in hers. Amor, her tail wagging with a slow, contented rhythm, smiled at him, her golden eyes filled with a love that was as deep and as vast as the universe they had both come from. They had faced down a conspiracy, they had a prophecy, and they had found a love that was more real and more true than either of them could have ever imagined. The frozen throne hall, once a theater of conspiracy and impending doom, had settled into a profound and lasting peace, a silent testament to the events that had unfolded within its ancient stone walls. The firelight from the braziers now cast a warm, steady glow, and the banners of the great clans hung motionless, no longer swaying with the invisible currents of political turmoil. The throne itself, a massive, unyielding slab of stone, was no longer a cage of tradition but a seat of earned power, occupied by Queen Amor. She sat with a quiet, confident authority, her spine straight and her golden eyes clear, a leader who had been tested and had proven her worth. At her side, in a chair he had custom-built to be the exact height of her own, sat Nick, a human consort whose presence had once been an unforgivable anomaly, but was now a source of strength and admiration for the entire court. His black officer's coat was a stark, disciplined line against the soft, flowing furs of the nobles, a symbol of the two worlds that had been brought together by a twist of destiny and a conscious choice. His jawline, once a mark of his defiant past, was now a badge of honor, a silent testament to the battle he had fought and won not just for himself, but for the queen he had come to love. The court, once a hotbed of intrigue and silent judgment, now regarded him with a deep, abiding respect. He was no longer just the human diplomat, but the one who had not only saved their queen, but had fought beside her, a trusted partner whose wisdom and quiet courage were a constant, reassuring presence in a world governed by primal instinct. Their days were a steady, deliberate rhythm of governance, a beautiful, symbiotic dance of two entirely different minds working in perfect harmony. Amor, with her intuitive grasp of her people's needs and her fierce, protective love for them, would listen to her advisors with a newfound patience and clarity, her judgments no longer clouded by the constant threat of a conspiracy. Nick, in turn, would use his diplomatic experience and his human ingenuity to introduce new, pragmatic ideas. He helped her establish a new form of a council, one that included not just the traditional clan leaders, but also representatives from all strata of society, a concept of shared governance that was foreign but welcomed. He taught them the value of written, binding agreements and the power of reasoned debate, and she taught him the importance of instinct and the unbreakable strength of a single, unified purpose. Their love, born from a bizarre and terrifying encounter, had matured into a deep and profound partnership, one that was not just personal but had a far-reaching, positive impact on the entire planet. They were a team, a perfect balance of logic and instinct, of human resilience and ferocity, and their union was the foundation of a new era of peace and prosperity. As the weeks turned into months, Nick's human roots began to intertwine with the deep, ancient soul of. He learned the rhythms of the seasons, the quiet languages of the forests, and the unwritten laws of the people. He found a strange and fulfilling peace in the simplicity of their lives, a contrast to the endless, complicated machinations of galactic diplomacy. He would often accompany Amor on her royal tour, walking through villages and ancient forests, listening to the stories of her people and sharing tales of his own. They were no longer the rulers of a kingdom but a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of what could be achieved when differences were embraced and shared destinies were fought for. He had come here with a clear mission, to secure a treaty and go home. But he had found a new purpose, a new home, and a new life in the arms of a woman he had once seen as nothing more than a dangerous, unpredictable alien. He had found a love that was not bound by the stars or by the laws of his home world, but by a bond that had been forged in the fire of their shared survival. In a quiet moment alone in their chambers, with the moon casting a silver glow through the windows, Amor and Nick finally spoke of the past. The fated bond, the bizarre and beautiful anomaly that had brought them together, was a subject that had remained largely unspoken between them, a shared secret they had both accepted without question. But now, in the stillness of the night, Amor brought it up, her golden eyes, filled with a deep, loving understanding, meeting his. "You know, my human," she said, her voice a low, melodious hum, "that the fated bond was a complete and utter lie." Nick, with a small smile, simply nodded, his hand reaching out to take hers. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "It was just a chemical reaction, a twist of fate that was a pure coincidence." The words hung in the air, a final, beautiful truth that had taken them a solar cycle to reach. They both knew that the prophecy that had been spoken in that throne hall had been a complete and utter lie, a manipulation by a man who had tried to control the fate of a queen. But they also knew that the bond that had grown from that lie, the deep and profound connection they had built in the fire of their shared survival, was the only truth that mattered. Amor, her tail wagging with a slow, contented rhythm, a sign of her complete and utter happiness, leaned her head on his shoulder. "I did not choose you because of a prophecy," she whispered, her voice a quiet confession. "I chose you because of the man you were. You were the only one who did not run from me, the only one who stood his ground. You taught me that strength is not just in the size of your body, but in the resilience of your spirit." Nick, in turn, wrapped his arm around her, his hand resting on her back, his touch as gentle as a whisper, and kissed the top of her head. "And you, my love," he said, his voice filled with a love that was as deep and as vast as the universe itself. "You taught me that home is not a place but a feeling. My home is here, with you." He had come to negotiate a treaty, to be a small part of a much larger galactic story, but he had found something far more profound. He had found a new world, a new purpose, and a new family in the arms of a woman who had once tried to bite him. Their legacy, a love story that would be whispered in the halls for generations to come, was not one of prophecy or of magic, but of a fierce, earned love. It was a story of a human diplomat and an alien queen who had found common ground in their differences, a story of two different souls who had found a shared destiny in the face of insurmountable odds. They had faced down a conspiracy, they had a prophecy, and they had built a love that was more real and more true than either of them could have ever imagined. Their lives, a beautiful, symbiotic dance of two different worlds, were a testament to the fact that the most powerful bonds were not the ones that were handed to you by fate, but the ones that you fought for together. The final scene of their story was a testament to their love, a simple, quiet moment in their private chambers, with Nick sitting beside her throne, his hand in hers, a human at home in an alien world and a queen at peace, her tail wagging with a slow, contented rhythm, her golden eyes filled with a love that was as deep and as vast as the universe they had both come from. The story was complete, the narrative was closed, and their love, a quiet, beautiful thing, would last for a lifetime and beyond.